Okay, I think we're going to start right now. So thanks everyone for coming, for being here today. So I'm Cédric Téton. I'm one of the co-founder of Promyze. I'm also the CEO of the company. So Promyze, we are a startup based in Bordeaux, in France. And so we are developing a collaborative platform dedicated to software best practices, definition, and sharing. So during this webinar, I will introduce you with Promyze, and I will make a short demo of our solution. But today the topic will be, as I said, the definition of and sharing of best coding practices. But before going into Promyze, I will give you a bit of context to understand what are the challenges and the problem that we address at Promyze. Why is it important to address this topic of sharing, of best practices sharing in IT organization? Okay, so we'll just spend maybe 10 minutes of introduction, and then we will get into Promyze. Just some links if you want to follow us. So I've just listed the Twitter or LinkedIn account. We also blog on Dev and Medium platform. We also have a Slack workspace, a public workspace. You can find the link on our website on the main page. And maybe I will give it in the chat during the presentation. Feel free to ask any questions on the chat. Okay, I will try to follow the questions, any question you may have. I know that some of my colleagues, Arthur, who is CTO at Promyze, he will be able to answer your questions. Maybe if I don't see it, or don't worry. Thanks for the link. So okay, now let's get started. As you can see in Bordeaux, we have a very nice summer, 25 degrees, which is quite well for a webinar. Okay, let's get started. So now today, as I said, we have a short intro. So what are the topics we are going to talk today? What are the challenges we have? We'll discuss about technical debt, okay, code quality issues, maintainability issues. I'm sure you already heard a lot about this. This is a very specific and very complex challenge in IT today. So I will give you some fact about that. We understand why is it important to align our coding practices in companies to keep source code consistent and easy to maintain. We'll talk also about code reviews. Why is it important to continuously share technical knowledge in companies? The turnover problematic in IT industry, how we can prevent knowledge loss. And finally, how can we optimize the onboarding process? So don't worry, we just cover quickly each of that topic, but it's very important for me to give an overview of all the problems we address at Promyze and why we build this collaborative platform. So let's go. Let's get started. Maybe you already saw that number. So they are extracted from two different studies. Okay, the first one on the left is extracted from the developer coefficient report provided by Stripe in 2018. Okay, so 3 years ago, and they realized that after answering question around to 2,000, 3,000 developers around the world, that on average, a developer spends 42% on his time to rework source code, to understand what is this code doing, to rework technical debt, to fix bad code, to fix quality issues, and then he can start to work on his task. He can start to add value to the software. Okay, so that means that only 58% of a developer's time is dedicated to add value to a software. This is this is so few, okay. It's not enough. There is a huge problem here, and it's very interesting to see that those numbers are still the same today, 3 years later. So there is a recent study from Step Size. You can get this report on their website, and this is not exactly the same number, but as you can see, there is quite the same time, around 30 hours per week for a developer is dedicated to either technical debt fixing or any other maintenance work. Okay, so it's the same concept. Around 60% of the time of a developer is dedicated to add value to the software. Okay, so now just imagine if we can maintain our source code in a high quality level during the whole project. That means that we can deliver value faster, we can ensure a high time to market, and so on. Okay, so we are able to innovate, to add innovation to our software. Okay, so the very important thing to keep in mind that is that source code for most IT companies is an asset. Okay, it's a strength, because thanks to your source code, thanks to your software, you can make business. Okay, you can generate money, and so you need to make sure that the source code remains in a high quality level. Otherwise, you face technical debt, you face maintainability issues, and so you will definitively lose business, lose money, and so on. So our vision at Promyze is to say, okay, it's easy to say that we have to produce high quality code, sustainable source code, but how to make that? I mean, the main thing, the main idea is that developers must know, they must be aware of how to achieve, how to write high quality code. And here comes the best practices. Okay, if our developers know how to write good code, we can be sure that at the end we will get high quality code. Okay. Otherwise, if we don't know how to make that, we may introduce some technical debt. Okay. So we need to focus on the human, on the developers who work on the company. There is one fact in all IT companies is that developer skills are heterogeneous. Okay, so we all are unique. We have our own expertise areas, and we also have some lacks in some domains. Okay, so each developer, for instance, has some expertise in Java. For instance, for me, I know a bit Node.js, Java. I don't know how to write a line of code in React, for instance. So I have a big lack in React, but I have some expertise a bit in Java. Okay. And this is the same for many concepts, many practices. So in a company, you will get some developers who have some skills, some strong skills in clean architecture, clean code, security concept, performance. And some other developers, we have some different expertise areas. Okay, because we all have our own background, experiences, and so on. So we are all different. So that's a cool thing, okay? Because we are all unique, but we need to remember one thing, and that's why knowledge sharing is very crucial for companies. When you have a group of people, you need to remember that a chain is only as strong as its weakened link. Okay, and our lack of skills, because I don't know how to write React code, for instance, I may introduce some bad code with bad design, and above all, I may introduce some bugs. And bugs, this is definitively something we don't want to introduce in our software. We want to avoid bugs. Okay, so even if in my team I have 3 developers who are mastering React.js, if I don't know how to write React.js code properly, it's a big risk for the project. Okay, so I need to catch up my colleagues. I need to increase my technical skills to learn the best practices on React.js. Okay, that's why the knowledge sharing from my other developers, this is crucial for me, and this is crucial for the company. Let's talk about the knowledge loss. This is something very common in our industry. Maybe you know already that, but the turnover in IT industry, this is the most important, okay, all over the world, because we have some facts, some numbers. I give some inputs here, but we what we know from recent studies. So we have the highest turnover rate, okay, compared to some other sectors. It's almost twice the average turnover rate in other industries, okay. And so we know that developer stays no more than 3 years in average. So what we mean here is that we have many chances to lose knowledge if we don't set process, if we don't set tools or whatever you want to keep this knowledge in the company. Okay. So knowledge loss is really a challenge in our industry because we need to live with high turnover. Okay, that's the specificity of our domain, and so that's why knowledge sharing between developers, between all the people in the IT department in the company, this is something very important. And this is even more true in startup, in scaling startup, which we have a much more higher turnover rate, as you can see, almost 25-30%. So it's a lot. So this is something we need to prevent, and we need to be prepared to live with. So to share knowledge, to define knowledge, many companies use some tools like Wiki. Maybe you know tools like Confluence, like Notion. We use such tool, by the way, at Promyze, but there are some limitations because these tools are very generic. They can be used by IT department, by accountable, and so on. Everyone in the company can use such tools, so they are very generic. And so we met a lot of teams, a lot of companies that try to use Wiki to record and to share best practices, but they have limitation because it's very challenging to feed. The, we It's very challenging to maintain this wiki. How we can do that? Who is going to write some best practices in the wiki? How can we come up with the best practices? We need some context. It's not just a brainstorming where we are going to try to list all of our best practices. Okay, it's very hard, and it takes some time. We need to keep it up to date. Our best coding practices are evolving over time. Every 2-3 months at Promyze, we see that we make our practices evolve. So we need to keep this database of practices up to date, and it takes some time. And we need to give some clear documentation. Okay, because if I write some best practices, it must be understood by everyone. So we need to add some relevant examples. So, but how can we find this example? Sometimes we are just writing some hello world basic example. We have not much interest. It's better to find some example extracted from our source code. And it's tricky sometimes to organize what are the best practices in our company, but sometimes each team, each project has its own context, as in its own technical context. Okay, so each team may have some specific best practices they need to record somewhere. And it's tricky to organize a wiki with different levels. Let's say we have a global React.js in this page and our specific React.js practices, how to make sure we don't have duplications and so on. This is quite tricky. And most of all, these tools are not really operational for developers because as a developer, I mainly use two kind of tools every day. My IDE, my VS Code, IntelliJ, whatever you want, and my Git platform, GitHub, GitLab, and that's all. So it's not really convenient for me when I'm writing code to have my wiki, just open somewhere because there's no direct interaction. And so that's why, as a developer, I have some difficulties just to read, to consult, to get in touch with the wiki. I don't read it so much. So there is someone who is trying to keep it up to date, but as a developer, I don't really read this wiki, and that's a lack we need to fill. And there is a unique direction between developer and wiki. Okay, developers are writing best practices, concepts in the wiki, but there's no feedback loop. Okay, the wiki don't really help developers on a daily basis. Okay, it just I wrote some text. Okay, and that's all. Then all developers need really to get the information inside the wiki. So that's why even if it's a good start, but quickly you have limitation, and almost 90% of the teams we met started a wiki, but 1 month or 2 months later, it was very outdated and they stopped to use that. The code review process, as you know, code reviews is one of the method which is widely adopted in the IT industry because it's really relevant to share knowledge, to ensure code quality standards, and so on. But still, we know that this process can be improved. This is extracted from the State of Code Review report by Smart Beer in 2018. And we saw something interesting happening there. Mainly, code reviews, some developers stated that code reviews are sometimes too time consuming and repetitive. Why? Because when you are doing code reviews, sometimes it's common that it's a technical leader in a team of developers who is doing the code review. So he has to review every day the source code produced by each developer in the team. And so he has to repeat the same concepts, the same best practices as the developers may not know. So it takes a lot of time. He has to repeat a lot of concepts. And that's why sometimes this is time consuming. And there is something very frustrating also, is that once you have finished your code review, so maybe you are using the pull and merge request concept in GitLab or GitHub. Once you have written all your comments and validated the pull request and merged it, you don't really capitalize on the code review. Why? Because you just close, merge, and you don't go back on it again. You don't read it again. So everything you said in the code review, everything you wrote in the code review, that's lost. And that's too bad because maybe you explained some best practices that could benefit to everyone. So we are convinced that there is something we can improve here. And the last point I would like to focus in concerning the onboarding process. There is a link which is very interesting about the true cost of hiring a new developer, because sometimes you think, okay, you just replace one guy by another one, and so if they have the same wage, it costs you the same amount of money, but this is wrong. Hiring a new programmer costs a lot because you spend time and thus money to source new candidates, to look for new candidates, to interview, review application, make some technical tests, and so on. And then the new developers come in your company. And some studies said that it takes around 29 weeks. It's a lot. So I guess it depends a lot of the company and the project, of course. But there is something true, is that you want to optimize the onboarding process to make sure that your developers will be productive as soon as possible. Because the onboarding process is very time consuming, but this is necessary. I mean, if someone is coming to your team, you need to learn. He needs to learn the best practices, the coding standards, the business knowledge, and so on. So it will take time. You can't you can't skip that part, but maybe you can make it differently. Maybe you can find some tricks, some relevant tools, methods to speed that process, to gain time, and to save time, for instance, during his first code reviews. So from all these points, the purpose of writing high quality source code, avoiding technical debt, heterogeneous skills, and so on, there is plenty of domains in IT companies that we want to address at Promyze, and that's why we built our collaborative solution Promyze that I'm gonna to show you right now. Just a quick overview. You need to remember that Promyze is a three-step process mainly. The first step is to identify best practices. So Promyze basically will be used by all developers in the company. And the goal of Promyze is to let developers create their best practices from the source code. So we're going to let developers use our plugins, Promyze, whatever they want, to identify in their source code some best practices they may follow. Okay. Then the second step, we are going to gather all the team, okay, to discuss about their best practices they identified just before. Okay, this is the second step. So they're going to be agree or disagree, keep some best practices, but they have some technical discussion and interaction, and they will create some best practices. And then there is a feedback loop that because developers are going to feed a Promyze with some best practices, and in return, Promyze will help developers during their code review or while they are writing source code in their RDE. Okay, so we're going to see this full process right now. Just a few words. Promyze is available on Promyze and cloud. There is a 30-day free trial available on promyze.com. You can just create your account in 1 minute. Just create an organization, start inviting your colleagues, your friends, and you can start enjoying the platform. Let's get started. So we are in Promyze right now. Okay. I'm logged with Bob. Okay, I'm single developer in the company. As you can see, I am in my space marketplace web. So just imagine that in Promyze, we create spaces for each team, each project. We can also have a space for a community of practices. So Promyze can be used within a single team or across team. Okay, it's very free. So the basic concept, okay, as I said, is to let developers identify some best practices and have some discussions during craft workshop. So this is a concept we created at Promyze. So here I have created, we have created in my team a craft workshop. Okay, that will happen. Okay, in 1 week. Actually, craft workshop will happen once a week or once every 2 weeks, sometimes once every 3 weeks. It really depends on your project, on your content, the size of the team, the velocity of your project, and so on. But on average, this is once every 2 weeks. At Promyze, we're doing a craft workshop every Friday afternoon. So it's very free. And so what we're going to discuss during this craft workshop, we're going to discuss about some best practices developers identified during their daily work. Okay. So we have different ways to contribute to Promyze. We can do it through the web interface, but we can also use our plugins ecosystem. So I will just show you an example of how to contribute to Promyze. Just a single thing here. You see this happy and test. This is just the name of the workshop. Sometimes you can give a topic to a specific workshop, but it's not mandatory. Okay, this is just an example we use. You can name it whatever you want. So in a craft workshop, you can put some source code, some source code snippets, some files. You can also use our plugins to feed the workshop with some content, with some files. So let's take an example here. To two files are available. This is some source code we work recently in our team. Okay, maybe this work is the source code is already in production. Okay, but we think it could be interesting that everyone in the team take a look on this code and try to identify maybe some parts that could be improved, or inversely highlight some parts of the code that follow some best practices. So it's like of catching good things and things that could be improved. So let's take an example. So as you can see, I'm a JavaScript file. We support all programming language. Okay, we are completely independent of any language. So let's take, for instance, um, this. Okay, this piece of code. So this is very free. Okay, I can catch whatever I want as best practices. I can focus on clean code, on JavaScript, on architecture, on design, security, best performance, green IT. It's completely free. Okay, I can really identify whatever I want. So here, for instance, there is something which is very interesting in our project. It's the use of a pattern called repository to manipulate object. Okay, this is something which is done here. You can see the usage of user basket repository. I really want to highlight that this is a good way to manipulate objects. Okay, so I'm just gonna select this line. Okay, and now as you can see, there is my database of practices which just appeared. When you start Promyze from scratch, you don't have some best practices. Okay, the purpose is really to create your best practices. We're working to add some catalogs of best practices so that you can get them if you want for your organization. So now I can look for my best practices. If it exists, that's cool. I will just tag it. If it doesn't exist, I will just create a new one. So I will now try to write my best practice. I'm gonna call it user repository to handle object. This is not existing, okay? So that's cool. I'm gonna create it. I'm supposed to get to write some few words to describe the best practices, but okay, I will do it later. I can have some categories which are kind of tags, some hashtags, and say, okay, this is either positive or negative tag. Uh, is this best practice followed or not? In my case, this is followed, so I'm gonna say this is a positive tag. Okay, I can do the same thing with negative tag and so on. It's right it's very a good practice to have a balance between positive and negative tags, because um, it's very important to highlight that some source code follows some best practices, that the work has been done correctly. If you can do it, really you shouldn't avoid that. I mean, it's always nice as a developer to hear from someone else that we made some good jobs. Okay, so I can do it through this process of identification through the web interface. I can also do it during my daily work in my IDE. So we have some plugins for Visual Studio Code, and all the JetBrains suites. So IntelliJ, WebStorm, Rider, PHP, Storm, WebStorm, and so on. And so the plugin let us have access to all our best practices. Okay, so I have some basic information that I can read at any time. So I have a tight integration with my daily tool. And I have also a use case interesting with my plugins. I can catch some best practices, okay, in my code quickly with the plugin. So let's take an example here. And maybe some of you are writing code with JavaScript, okay? Maybe you are seeing a pattern here. I'm I can see a for loop, okay, and inside this for loop, I have an await keyword, which is a blocking call, okay? And as you can see, all these calls could be run independently from each other. So that's too bad because we have really a performance issue here. Because all this code in this for loop could be done in parallel, okay? So I will encourage me to use this structure. I don't know if you know the Promyze.all structure in JavaScript that allows to run some queries in parallel, okay? So what can I do here? It just to select this line of code, right click, I open the Promyze menu. I'm gonna click on tag selection as a new practice example, okay? Because I know this is something we didn't discuss yet with my team. This is a negative example. And now we'll write uh, at the top of the screen the name of my best practices. So I'm gonna call it Promyze.all should be used for parallel calls, like that. Up. I will send it to my space. I will now add a category, okay, performance. Okay, and that's sent to Promyze. And now, as I'm working on this code, I'm gonna fix it, okay? So I'm gonna just replace it up to make it quick with the Promyze.all usage. Okay? So according to me, this is the right thing to do. Maybe my colleagues will not be agree with me, but at least we will have this discussion, and we will be able to align our coding practices on that concept. So once I fix that code, I can set this correction to Promyze. Okay, so thanks to the Promyze plugin, I can use the menu send changes as a correction to previous negative tag. Okay, so I just count the code before and after. Okay. So as the same, I can identify some best practices followed as some best practices which have not been followed. Okay, this is very important to have a balance. But as you can see, this is very short, so we can do it every day. Okay, in order to feel Promyze. I can also do this identification during my code review. So we are compatible with GitLab, GitHub, GitLab, Azure DevOps, and Bitbucket on Promyze and cloud. And we have, thanks to the plugin that you can install in your web browser, Chrome, Firefox, Edge, and Opera, you can have this contextual menu. You can first of all get all your best practices. Okay, if you want to have a kind of checklist, or maybe refer to some best practices documentation while you are commenting, instead of explaining again the new practices. But you can also identify directly some pieces of code that reflect best practices. So you can still write, okay, this is the right thing to do, but sometimes you think, okay, maybe this will benefit to my whole team. So I can catch it right now and send it to Promyze. So for instance, here we are working on AngularJS source code. And there is something I can do. This is to simply identify the source code, okay? As you can see, I want to highlight the fact that the @sync $onInit function is a good way to init AngularJS component. I don't know if some of you know AngularJS, but this is a nice thing to do, and I would like everyone in my team to say that. So just right-click on Promyze, tag selection as a practice example. I will create a new one. Okay, I would put it in my space marketplace web, and I'm gonna call it use on init to init AngularJS component. Okay. AngularJS as a tag. This is a positive example. Okay. And so I'm gonna also identify some best practices that may have not been followed. And once again, this could be benefit to everyone. So let's take this example here. As you can see, we are using we are using this format function. Okay, maybe some of you know Moment in JavaScript. This is a framework to manipulate dates and times mainly. And in my team, we have built a specific service to manipulate that. This is something we really want to avoid, is that everyone use his own date format. Okay, so we centralize every date manipulation in a specific format. So maybe the developer who wrote this code didn't know that. Okay, so I can make a comment, of course, but it's also interesting that everyone in the team is aware of that. So I'm gonna just catch this line, right click on Promyze, tag selection as a practice example, and with the same principle, I'm gonna use that formatter service to manipulate that. Oh, hashtag that's, and that's all. Okay. So this is mainly the process to identify best practices. Each developer can make this operation 3 or 4 times in a week. It's enough to run the craft workshop. So now let's move forward in time. Assume we are 30 September. So let's get started with the craft workshop session. So let's just imagine all the team is gathered. Okay, we are all together at the office remotely, so someone has to share his screen, okay, like any remote meeting, and we are going to review each best practices contribution one by one, and everyone can, each developers can explain why he thinks it's a good practice followed or not, and thus comes some discussions within the team. Are we agree or not? So here, for instance, we're going to start with me, Bob. I will explain why I think Promyze.r should be used for parallel cores. So we're going to see the source code before, and we can also write some correction, display the correction. So I have the diff before and after, so then everyone gets my point of view. This is a one way to do. Okay. Now with my team, I'm going to discuss. Are you agree? Should we validate this practice because this is a new one? Should we delete, not keep it for some reasons I did not know? Okay, but if we all agree with that, this is the most important thing. Okay. Otherwise, we can also refine the rule. Maybe this is not exactly Promyze.o that should be used, but something else. And we can also start a battle. A battle, this is a way to write some arguments to vote. And the idea is to start the next workshop by reviewing existing battles so that we can decide all together what to do with this practice. And we can also record in this way all the decision we made. We can keep why we decided to discard or to keep best practices at some point. Okay, maybe it's some in the future this decision will be reviewed, will be updated maybe, but at least we can understand, we can keep track why it's important, why we decided to keep or not this practice. So assume we all agree, I'm going to validate this practice. And every time we are identifying a piece of code and validate some example or counter example, the thing you need to remember, which is very important, is that we are kind of documenting the rule, because the best practices in Promyze can have a description, but every time you make some identification in the source code, you keep record of each example and counter example. So you have some contextual example from your source code. And that's something which is very interesting, because you don't have some hello world example for describing best practices. You find the concrete description in your own source code. Okay, and developers feed themselves this description. So that's something interesting. So okay, the idea of the craft workshop is to review this practice, so to validate new practices, to enrich the description of some existing practices. And we end the workshop by reviewing our existing practices, maybe just to make it up to date, make it consistent, make it clear. But we can also discover some best practices from other spaces. So imagine we are 10 teams in the company working on JavaScript. It's interesting to see which practices have been created from other teams. Okay. So that's something very interesting to share knowledge. We create some best practices as a team, as a community of practices, but thanks to Promyze, we can also be aware, be notified of what are the new best practices that have been created from other teams. Okay, and we finish the review with creating the next workshop and so on. So we basically have of our practices in our space. We can create some public catalogs. Okay, um, you have the possibility, to create some bundle of best practices based on some categories. So sometimes in company you have a group of people dedicated to share and to define best practices for security, for instance. And so the idea is to make this catalog publicly available for everyone, to make it up to date, so that everyone can subscribe to this catalog and get access to these common best practices. So we really work on that topic of best practices sharing with Promyze. Okay. And you remember the first step? The first step of Promyze was to identify best practices. The second step of the process was to realize some craft workshop as a team to decide together which best practices to keep or not. And there was a third step. Don't know if you remember. The first step was the feedback loop. Okay, so now that we tell Promyze what are our best practices and gave him some example and counter example of source code. Now Promyze can help us during our code review or while we are working in our IDE. So maybe you saw this feature during my first part of the demo. We have this feature of automatic suggestions. Okay, so the idea is to help developer to alert him to say, your source code you are writing, okay, based on my cursor, this is something which looks like some examples or counter examples of best practices we saw in the past. Okay, so here, for instance, my plugin is telling me that I shouldn't use Promyze.all for I should use Promyze.all for parallel codes because he has identified that I'm working on a for loop and match also the await keywords. So it's basically a tokens similarity of the source code. Okay, I saw Promyze is telling me that I'm using a for loop instead of for each. Okay, and also I do not use try catch, but I'm writing some HTTP course and I'm missing the try catch section. So the idea is wherever you are in the code, Promyze is trying to tell you you are on the right way with these practices. Okay, and sometimes to alert you that maybe you are not following some best practices. And as I said, this is working for every programming language. Let's check on the SCSS.file. As you can see, there is the best practices I'm not currently following. Let's have a look. Okay, I should rather use percentage instead of VH. Okay, my bad, I didn't know. Another example with HTML. As you can see, I'm trying to use a translation system, but I'm writing this code, which is not really fine because I'm writing three. This is kind of duplication just to handle three different cases, 0, 1, and there is something which is uh, already integrated in this translation library, and I have thus in this description two example, one positive, one negative. So what should I do? What should I shouldn't do? And so I can see that finally I could use this mechanism to handle plurality in my translation. Okay, so it's very interesting because we try really to support developers while they are coding and also while they are doing their code review. So I have also this concept of practices suggestions. Okay, and so now, as you can see, there is a refresh of best practices suggestion while I'm moving uh, my cursor on the web page. And so there is something interesting here. As you can see, I'm working with HTTP course, and Promyze tell me, be careful. I think you should use some try catch around this course. And it's correct because he saw that in the past. But he also tells me that there is a best practice which is followed is we are encapsulating HTTP calls within API services, which is the best practices in my context. So as you can see, once I move my mouse, there this section is refreshed. Okay, so this is quite real time, and so this is very helpful during a code review because it helps you to catch, to identify some potential issues in your code. Okay, and as I said, this is something which is based on token similarity. Okay, so you can also identify in the specific example which tokens are more relevant than other ones. For instance, something what I want to focus is really those elements, the format token, each yeah moments. This is something interesting. The other are not really relevant. So the algorithm will really consider more this token than the other. So we can tune this configuration basically. Okay, so this is really a short introduction to Promyze. I wanted also to give you some input on the pricing of Promyze and so on. We have decided to work with universities, schools that teach software development, um, and so there is a specific offer for these structures. Promyze is free if you are a teacher in a company. I don't target specific people here, but there is a possibility to for you to use Promyze during your courses, and or for your students during a project, even in a short session, because it can be used during code reviews processes. It can be used for you to record your best practices and reuse it from one year to another year, or one lesson to another lesson, whatever you want. And so feel free to reach with us if you may be interested with that. Okay, so that's all. I must talk 45 minutes. I think it's enough. I will check I didn't check the chat. Yeah, I think Arthur, yeah, maybe answered some questions. Thank you. Did you have any question or comments? Anything? Feel free. Thank you, Mathieu. As I said, just if you want to give Promyze a try, there is a 30-day free trial. You can just find the link on the top right corner on this page. There is a simple button, Launch Promyze, and you can just create your first organization. Just give it a name. It's like a workspace in Slack, the same concept. Yep, Vincent. That's what I try to explain. It's free for students during their courses and for teachers. And also for open source project. Yeah, I forgot to mention. Thank you, Arthur. Okay. Also, this webinar is recorded. Okay. It will be available on Slack, on YouTube. Sorry. As Arthur said, feel free to come to our workspace on Slack workspace. You are welcome. We just released as well a short introduction of Promyze in 90 seconds. It's right to explain all the concept of Promyze to everyone. So feel free to take a look. It's very new. It has been released online two days ago. So feel free to share it if you want to make anyone know Promyze. Okay. If you don't have any other question, I'm still, yeah, you can reach me on LinkedIn, Twitter. You can reach us by mail or whatever you want. Maybe a light last question, maybe. Thank you, everyone. So have a nice day, have a nice evening, wherever you are, and hope to see you soon on Promyze. And see you maybe on the next webinar, which will be planned at the end of October. The topic will be released, will be decided in the next day. So we hope to see you there.